When Martha Reed started carving long, crooked trenches across the driest hill in Harper County, most people decided grief had finally done what 2 years of hard living could not. She spent whole mornings dragging loose stone into shallow channels that seemed to lead nowhere. Then she bought 6 rusted iron tanks from a dismantled railroad camp, hauled them home one at a time, and buried them behind her barn until only their inspection lids remained above the ground. Silas Crowe laughed louder than anyone. He told the men outside Patterson's store that Martha Reed was building roads for water that did not exist. By the end of summer, nobody was laughing. The deepest wells in the county were coughing up mud. Cattle stood around empty troughs with their ribs showing. Families were carrying buckets 3 miles in the heat because the public pump had gone dry. And every morning, the hand pump in front of Martha Reed's little farmhouse still brought up cold, clean water. The strange part was that Martha had never dug a new well. 6 months earlier, the winter wind still moved hard across the Kansas prairie, flattening the brown grass and shaking the loose boards on Martha's barn. She was 41 years old, widowed, and carrying more debt than she liked to count before breakfast. Her husband, Daniel, had died 2 summers earlier after a wagon accident left him with an infection no doctor could stop. What he left behind was 80 acres of poor ground, a small farmhouse, a barn that leaned a little farther east every year, and a 14-year-old son named Ethan, who had already learned not to complain about things they could not afford. There was also a mortgage. The paper belonged to Harper County Bank. The bank belonged, in every way that mattered, to men who did business with Silas Crowe. Silas owned the biggest cattle operation for 50 miles. He owned 3 deep wells on the western ridge, 2 pumping stations, most of the water wagons used during dry years, and enough land that a rider could cross his property for an hour without seeing the end of it. For years, people had called him a good man to know. What they usually meant was that he was a dangerous man to owe. Silas had wanted Martha's land since Daniel was alive. The reason was simple. Her farm sat between Crowe's western pasture and the main cattle trail leading south. If he owned her 80 acres, he could run cattle straight through instead of driving them 6 extra miles around the ridge. Daniel had refused every offer. After Daniel died, Silas waited 3 months before trying again. He rode out in a clean black coat, sat at Martha's kitchen table, and placed a number on a piece of paper that would have paid off the mortgage and left her enough to start over somewhere else. Martha read it once. Then she folded it in half and pushed it back across the table. Silas smiled like a man who had just heard a child make a bad decision. He told her land was only worth what a person could make it produce. Martha looked out the window at the dry hill behind the barn. "That depends on what you notice," she said. Silas never forgot the answer. That winter, Martha began walking her property after every storm. She was not looking at fences or cattle tracks. She was watching water. Whenever rain or melting snow came down the hill, she followed it. She watched where it ran fast, where it slowed, where it disappeared into the soil, and where it cut little scars through the earth before draining off her property and into the creek bed below. Daniel had once complained that their hill shed water like a tin roof. At the time, Martha had thought it was just another problem. Now she began wondering whether it was also an opportunity. She found an old agricultural pamphlet in a box of Daniel's papers. Half the pages were missing, and mice had chewed one corner, but there were drawings of farms built on slopes. The drawings showed shallow contour trenches designed to slow rain instead of letting it race downhill. That was enough to start. Martha marked the hill with twine. Then she began digging. Ethan came outside the first morning and watched her work for nearly 10 minutes. "Where's it supposed to go?" he finally asked. "Nowhere fast," Martha said. That answer confused him even more. By the end of the week, 3 neighbors had stopped along the road to ask what she was doing. Martha told them she was trying to keep rain from leaving before the ground had time to use it. One man laughed and said the county had bigger problems than rain running away. Martha agreed. That was exactly why she wanted to keep every drop she could. At the spring equipment auction, she bought things nobody else wanted. Bent gutter sections, cracked pipe, old valve fittings, 6 iron tanks left behind when a railroad work camp shut down. She paid almost nothing for them because every serious farmer at the auction considered them scrap. Silas happened to be there. He watched Martha bid on the tanks, then asked loud enough for half the yard to hear whether she planned to fill them with hope. A few men laughed. Martha checked the bottom seam of the nearest tank with her thumb and said nothing. That afternoon, she borrowed a wagon and hauled the first one home. Caleb Mercer helped her unload it. Caleb was 63 and had spent most of his life surveying grades and drainage for the railroad before a crushed knee ended his fieldwork. He had seen Martha's trenches from the road. Unlike everyone else, he did not ask why they were crooked. He asked how much fall she had between the upper trench and the barn. Martha told him. Caleb looked back toward the hill. You measured it? With a water level. That got his attention. He walked the property with her slowly, leaning on his cane. When they reached the half-dug pit behind the barn, Martha showed him where she planned to set the iron tanks, inside a stone-lined chamber below ground. The soil would protect the water from direct sun. A packed clay cap above the chamber would help keep it cool. Roof gutters would feed one line. The contour trenches would feed another after heavy rain. A settling box filled with gravel and sand would catch the worst of the dirt before water entered the tanks. And the tanks would be connected with valves, so one leak would not drain the whole system. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're not storing water." Martha looked at him. "You're storing time." That was the first moment anyone besides Ethan seemed to understand. Martha worked harder after that. She and Ethan repaired the barn gutters using mismatched sections of tin. They built a catch basin from stone. They laid pipe beneath the yard. Martha coated every questionable tank seam with pitch and tested each one before covering it. She also kept records. Every rainfall, every tank level, every gallon used, every gallon loss. She wrote the numbers in a black ledger Daniel had once used for feed purchases. When the first heavy March rain came through, Ethan ran outside barefoot because he wanted to see whether it worked. Water rushed down the hillside. Then it reached Martha's first trench and slowed. Instead of cutting straight toward the creek, it spread sideways. Some soaked into the ground. Some moved toward a stone spillway. From there, the excess entered a channel that ran toward the settling box behind the barn. Ethan lifted the inspection lid on the first tank. At first, they heard nothing. Then came the thin metallic sound of water striking iron. Ethan grinned so hard Martha started laughing. They filled less than one tank that day. It was not much, but it was proof. Within a month, Silas Crowe knew about the buried tanks. Martha never learned who told him. One morning she found boot marks behind the barn near the inspection lids. The prints were narrow, deep at the heel, and too clean to belong to Ethan or Caleb. Someone had walked directly to the tanks, not wandered, not guessed, walked directly there. Martha covered the lids with loose boards and straw after that. She also began checking the valves every evening. A week later, a county health officer arrived in a buggy. He apologized before he even stepped down. Someone had reported that Martha might be collecting contaminated runoff near livestock pens. Martha showed him the system. The barn roof fed one tank line. The hill channels fed another. The cattle yard drained in the opposite direction. Nothing crossed. The officer inspected the pipes, the settling box, and the covered storage chamber. He found no violation. 2 days later, Silas met Martha outside the bank. He said he had heard the county was concerned about her experiments. Martha told him the county had already inspected them. Silas smiled. Experiments have a way of getting expensive. So do mistakes, Martha said. His smile disappeared. Soon after, the bank sent Martha a letter reminding her that improvements affecting the value of mortgage property could be reviewed. The letter did not threaten foreclosure. It did not need to. Martha knew what it meant. Ethan read it twice and asked whether they could lose the farm. Martha put the paper back in the envelope. Not because of a ditch, she said. But that night she sat at the kitchen table long after Ethan had gone to bed, staring at the numbers in Daniel's old ledger. She had enough money for seed. Barely. Enough for taxes. Probably. Enough to fight the bank in court. Not even close. Still, the next morning she went back outside and kept digging. By April, the trenches stretched across most of the western slope. From the road, they looked almost ridiculous. Long, shallow curves cutting across a hill that had barely grown anything useful in years. People joked that Martha had drawn giant lines for clouds to follow. Silas repeated the best jokes at the stockyard. Then April passed without rain. At first, nobody worried. Kansas had dry springs before. Farmers planted anyway. By the second week of May, the wind had changed. It came hot from the south and stayed hot. Young grass stopped growing. Ponds pulled back from their banks. The topsoil hardened. The public well in town dropped 6 feet. Silas Crowe raised the price of delivered water by 20%. He blamed fuel, wagon repairs, and labor. Nobody liked it, but people paid. June arrived hotter. 2 shallow wells east of town failed within the same week. A third began bringing up water cloudy with silt. Silas's wagons ran from sunrise until after dark. Every barrel had Crowe Water Company painted on the side. Families who could not pay cash signed notes at the bank. Some pledged livestock. One man pledged 10 acres. Martha watched all of it carefully. She also watched her own tank levels fall. Her system had collected more winter and spring water than even Caleb expected, but it was not endless. She rationed from the beginning, drinking, cooking, a small vegetable patch, 2 milk cows, nothing wasted. Bath water went to trees, dishwater went to the garden. Every bucket had 2 jobs. By late June, Martha still had thousands of gallons. She told no one exactly how much. Then Sarah Bell came to her door after sunset. Sarah lived a mile north with 3 children and a husband who had been gone 12 days looking for railroad work. Her youngest girl had a fever. Their well had gone dry that morning. Sarah had gone to Crowe's filling station. The price was more than she had. The clerk offered credit if she signed a paper against their 2 horses. She walked away. Martha listened without interrupting. Then she took 2 clean barrels from the barn. She and Ethan filled them after dark. Sarah started crying before the second barrel was full. Martha told her not to. "Bring them back empty," she said. That was the only payment she asked. 3 nights later, Martha filled a tank for Mr. Harlan, an old farmer whose cattle trough had gone dry. Then another family came. Then another. Martha gave small amounts, never enough to threaten the whole reserve, enough to keep people alive. She asked everyone to keep quiet. For almost a week they did. Then somebody noticed Sarah Bell's children carrying clean water. Word traveled. People began looking toward Martha's place differently. Silas noticed too. By July, the drought had become the worst anyone under 60 could remember. Grass turned gray. Cattle gathered beneath fences because there was no shade anywhere else. The Crowe wells, drilled deeper than most, were still producing, but not like before. Silas had been pumping them almost without rest. He sold water to local families. He sold water to ranchers. And quietly, he sold large loads to cattle outfits passing through the county because outsiders paid cash. The water table dropped faster every week. Silas responded by raising prices again. Martha responded by lowering the valve on her household line. Then one morning, 3 riders came up her road. Silas was in front. Behind him rode Deputy Marshal Tom Avery and a county surveyor named Henry Cole. Silas did not bother with a greeting. He said there was reason to believe Martha was drawing groundwater from Crowe property through an unauthorized collection system. Martha almost smiled. The nearest Crowe well was more than 2 miles away. She asked what evidence he had. Silas pointed toward the barn. "Open it." Ethan was standing in the doorway. Martha looked at him once, then walked behind the barn. By then, neighbors had started gathering near the road. Silas had not come quietly. He wanted witnesses. Martha moved the straw aside and lifted the first iron inspection lid. Cool air rose from the chamber below. Henry Cole crouched and looked in. He expected a pipe disappearing into the ground. Instead, he saw iron tanks, 6 of them, connected side by side. Each one marked with chalk, each line labeled, each valve numbered. Martha opened the small wooden box mounted under the overhang. Inside was her ledger. She turned the pages slowly. March 4th, rainfall, 0.8 of an inch. Estimated collection, 1,180 gallons. March 19th, snow melt and roof collection, 640 gallons. April 2nd, storm collection, 2,310 gallons. Every entry had a date. Every source was listed. Every use was recorded. Henry walked the length of the system. He followed the pipe back to the barn gutters. He followed the other channel toward the hillside. He found no well, no pump shaft, no underground line crossing a property boundary, nothing taken from Silas Crowe. People began whispering. Silas stepped closer to one tank and looked down. "How much water is in there?" Martha closed the ledger. "Enough." That answer bothered him more than a number would have. By evening, half the town knew. The crazy widow had not found secret groundwater. She had saved rain. Water everyone else had watched run away in March was sitting under her yard in July. At Patterson's store, men who had joked about her trenches suddenly argued about how many gallons her roof could catch in one storm. At church, women asked Sarah Bell whether the story was true. At the Crowe office, Silas stopped laughing. The next morning, a notice appeared at the courthouse. Harper County was considering emergency water controls. Under the proposal, privately stored water above a certain quantity could be brought under county distribution authority during an extreme drought, and Silas Crowe's company was named as the recommended operator. Ethan read the notice twice. "They're just going to take it?" Martha looked down the road toward town. "They're going to try." The council meeting was packed. Silas stood near the front in a clean vest with papers stacked neatly in front of him. He did not talk about Martha. He talked about order. He talked about fairness. He talked about the danger of allowing individual citizens to control large water reserves while children in town went thirsty. It sounded reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Then he proposed that all major reserves be transferred into Crowe Water Company wagons for emergency distribution. Martha waited until he finished. Then she asked one question. How much water was Crowe Water Company paid to keep in reserve this year? The room went quiet. Silas looked at her. Martha repeated it. The town clerk, Walter Finch, shifted in his chair. Everyone knew the county had signed an emergency supply agreement with Crowe after the dry year 3 summers earlier. Few people knew the details. Martha did. Daniel had complained about the tax increase that paid for it. She asked Walter to bring out the contract. Silas said it was irrelevant. That was the moment people started paying attention. Walter brought the file. The contract required Crowe Water Company to maintain a protected emergency reserve through the summer, enough to supply the town for 30 days at minimum household levels. The county had already paid for it. Martha looked at Silas. Where is it? He said the drought had exceeded every forecast. Martha asked again, how much is left? Silas refused to answer. The council ordered an inspection. By the next afternoon, the answer was clear. Almost none. Records showed that during May and June, Crowe's company had sold enormous amounts of water from the reserve to cattle outfits passing south. Cash buyers, high prices, quick profit. The county had paid Silas to protect water for local families. Silas had sold much of it before the drought reached its worst point. That evening, people stood outside the courthouse in angry little groups. The emergency seizure order against Martha was suspended. Silas's distribution authority was placed under review. For the first time in years, he walked through town and nobody moved aside for him. Martha could have gone home satisfied. She did not, because the town was still running out of water. Exposing Silas had not filled a single barrel. Her tanks could keep her farm alive, maybe help a dozen families for a little while. They could not save Harper County. That night, Caleb found Martha studying a weather map at the kitchen table. A storm system was moving east from Colorado. No guarantee. But if it held together, the county might get its first real rain in months. Martha tapped the map. One storm won't fix the wells. No, Caleb said, but it could fill something. They both looked toward the old limestone quarry north of town. The quarry had been abandoned for 15 years. It was deep. Its lower basin was solid rock. And most important, 3 natural drainage channels fed toward it from the ridge. By morning, Martha had a plan. They would clear the old quarry, seal the worst cracks with clay, cut diversion channels along the upper ground, build crude settling basins, repair the old wagon culverts under the North Road. If the storm came, they would catch as much runoff as possible before it vanished downstream. Silas called the plan desperate. Martha agreed. Then she said desperate was not the same as foolish. Dozens of people volunteered. Men who had laughed at her trenches brought shovels. Women hauled stone. Teenage boys cleaned mud from culverts. Caleb marked grades. Ethan spent 2 straight days carrying stakes up the ridge. The work moved faster than Martha believed possible. For 3 days, the whole town built the same kind of crooked channels they had mocked on her hill. Then Walter Finch found something else. 2 Crowe water wagons were missing. The company ledger said they had delivered emergency water to the South District. The South District had received nothing. Martha checked the wagon seal numbers against the county records. Both wagons had been filled from the last protected holding tank. The coldest part of the drought had become the hottest week anyone could remember, and Silas had taken the last county water. They found the wagons behind the Crowe ranch house. 1 barrel was connected to a private cattle trough. The other fed the cistern beside Silas's house. There was no argument left. That night, the council stripped Crowe Water Company of every remaining piece of emergency authority. Silas stood at the back of the room while the vote was taken. No speech, no threats, no smile. For once, his name did not move anyone. Martha left before the meeting ended. The sky had changed. Clouds were building in the west. By midnight, thunder rolled across the prairie. The first drops were large enough to leave dark circles in the dust. Then the rain came hard. Water rushed off roofs. It filled ditches. It ran down wagon tracks. Across Martha's hill, the old contour trenches caught it exactly as they had months before, slowing the flow, spreading it, directing the excess toward her buried tanks. But Martha was not watching her own yard. She was standing at the quarry with Ethan, Caleb, Sarah Bell, Walter Finch, and half the town. They held lanterns in the rain. At first, the quarry floor stayed dry. Then a thin stream appeared in the upper channel. Another joined it, then another. Water spilled through the repaired culvert and down the limestone wall. People began shouting. Within an hour, the shallow basin was covered. By dawn, there were millions of gallons sitting where there had been dust the day before. Not enough to erase the drought, enough to change what came next. The town used the quarry water first for livestock, washing, and fire protection, saving the cleanest well water for drinking. Martha's storage design became the model for smaller household systems. Caleb helped families calculate roof area and tank size. Ethan learned to set contour lines better than most grown men. Sarah Bell organized a water schedule so older people did not have to stand in the sun waiting for their share. And for the first time, No single man controlled the valves. When the regular rains finally returned, the county canceled Crowe Water Company's emergency contract. An audit forced Silas to repay money he had taken for reserves he failed to maintain. The bank quietly voided several water debts signed during the worst weeks of the drought after the county threatened a wider investigation. Silas did not lose everything. Men like him rarely did. He still had cattle, still had land, still had a large house on the western ridge. What he lost was harder to replace. People stopped believing they needed him. That autumn, Martha helped form the Harper Water Cooperative. Membership cost almost nothing. Families contributed labor instead. Some dug storage pits. Some repaired gutters. Some built stone channels. Some learned how to test and cover water properly. Martha shared every measurement she had written in Daniel's old ledger. She kept nothing secret. By the next spring, shallow curved trenches could be seen on farms all across the county. Some were neat, some were rough, some worked better than others. But people were watching water now. They watched where it moved, where it escaped, where it could be slowed, where it could be saved. One evening, Ethan stood with Martha on the hill behind their barn. The grass had come back green. Below them, the iron tank lids were almost invisible under new growth. Farther out, sunlight caught the pale lines of fresh contour trenches on one neighbor's property, then another, then another. Ethan smiled. They all look like ours. Martha looked across the county. A year earlier, men had laughed because she was digging crooked lines into dry ground. Now those same lines curved across farm after farm. Ethan asked whether she had known from the beginning that it would work. Martha thought about the nights she had lain awake worrying about the mortgage, the tank seams, the bank, the drought, Silas Crowe. All the ways one bad guess could have cost them everything. No, she said. I just knew water kept leaving, and nobody was asking it to stay. The wind moved softly through the grass. Below them, one of the new collection channels still held a little rain from the night before. It did not run fast. It did not disappear. It simply waited there long enough for the ground to take what it needed. And that, Martha had learned, was sometimes the difference between having nothing when trouble came and having enough to get through it.